Hi folks, this is video number 3, Agricultural Regions of the World, Unit 5, Agriculture. So you should take a moment to set up your notes to look like these. And before we get started, I just want to give you some context. It's important that you know that there is a correlation between climate and agriculture. What this means is the reason why there is different types of agriculture in different places in the world has to do with three things. It has to do with climate, soil, and culture. So an example for climate, oranges and citrus fruits cannot grow outside of a tropical climate. An example for soil, the soil in the desert is sand. It does not have enough fertility to produce something like a tomato. And another example for culture is people living in Asia depend on rice as a staple in their diet. So we see different types of agricultural production in different climatic, soil, and cultural regions. Even though there are some technologies today that allow places to overcome their environmental limitations, we still kind of use this climatic map as a rule of thumb. And so you may see these climates described as the type of weather that they are, or you may just see the climate names. But if you just know the general climate regions of the world, you will be good. Okay, so let's talk about agriculture, and we'll talk about climate at the same time. So the first type of agriculture we're going to talk about is truck farming. This is found you can see here, southeastern United States, as well as the eastern coast of the U.S., and then we also see it on the western coast of the U.S. as well, and then you can see some pockets here in Central Asia. And so truck farming is also known as commercial gardening or fruit farming. And this is the dominant form of agriculture that we see in that humid subtropical part of the United States. This is due to a really long growing season and a humid climate. So think about on the coasts is where we're going to find this type of farming. And what's being farmed here are fruits and vegetables. The majority of the fruits and vegetables that we see in more developed societies come from this type of farming. So they do sell some of their product to fresh markets, so like produce, but the majority of their products are sold to processors to be canned or frozen. And the truck farms are oftentimes owned by large corporations. So Green Giant is an example of one of those corporations. These places are highly efficient and they are large scale. Think agribusiness. They take full advantage of machinery and technology, very capital intensive. Even though it's capital intensive and it's large scale over vast areas of land, the yields are very, very high, which means that it's actually intensive. Labor is actually kept really low by hiring migrant workers, and some of those migrant workers may be undocumented immigrants from Mexico. Okay, the next type that we're going to talk about is dairy farming. This is commercial agriculture, and you can see that it's very popular in the northeast of the United States. We also see it in Canada, Northern Europe. You can see some patches here in Russia. And then lastly, I'd like to point out here that India is one of the largest producers of milk in the entire world. And so dairy production is much different today than it was 100 years ago because we see the intense mechanization of dairying. Here's the thing, 100 years ago, it took a ton of farmers to run a dairy farm because cows have to be milked twice a day. However, now that we have mechanization and we have milking machines and we have computers to keep track of how much milk is coming out of which type of cows, and we have refrigerated gallon tanks to collect this milk in, it's become a lot less labor intensive. However, it is very capital intensive, which means that it costs a lot of money. This has contributed to disappearing of small dairy farms in the United States and around the world because it costs so much money to operate a dairy farm. Cows are really expensive to feed in the winter when they can't be grazing. So dairy farming is kind of an exclusive type of agriculture now. So it's important to know that milk production, while it is profitable, it has issues environmentally. So if the cow manure is not handled in the correct way by the farmers, it can contribute to climate change because the CO2 released by the cows emits greenhouse gases. And when there are so many of these dairy cows, that adds up. In addition to that, their manure, if not handled correctly, can sometimes leak into local water supplies and contribute to a decreased level of water quality. The next type is mixed crop in livestock. What this means is on these farms, we see crops being grown as well as livestock being raised. This is the most popular form of agriculture in the United States. And most of the crops that are grown on these farms are not consumed by humans or sold to be eaten. They are made into feed for the animals on that farm. And this actually allows farmers to distribute the workload more evenly throughout the year, and it reduces seasonal variation in income. So we see this in much of the US and Northern Europe, and we also see this extension out into Central Asia and Russia as well. And the climates that we see mixed crop and livestock farming in are very similar to what we see here in Ohio, with hot summers and cold winters. And so some examples of those climates are humid subtropical, marine west coast, and humid continental. And so think about weather in Ohio is very similar to where we're finding these types of farming practices. So a large variation between summer and winter. Corn is usually what's grown here, and then it's made into feed for the animals, but we also see soybeans grown on these types of farms as well. However, the majority of the income of the farmer is associated with the sale of animal products. It is an extensive form of agriculture because we have large areas for the cows to graze, and we do not need a whole lot of human work to get those high yields. However, we do see some soil degradation and erosion associated with this type of farming because oftentimes the land becomes overplowed, and that contributes to a less healthy soil. Grain farming is the next type. This includes wheat and corn, and we see this in North America, the US and Canada. We also see it in Russia, Argentina, Australia, France, the United Kingdom, China, and India. The Great Plains is one of the largest regions in the world that specializes in the production of grain, and the U.S. is the largest producer of grain in the world. Wheat is actually the world's leading export crop, so these are really popular types of agriculture. However, it is definitely commercialized. We see mass planting and harvesting of things like wheat, barley, and millet. And I just want to point out, this is what millet looks like here, and then this right here is sorghum. So those are also grain products. These fields take up an enormous amount of space, and remember, they can be used in so many different products. So this is done in drier climates, such as steppe or humid continental. So we do see a lot of soil degradation in these farms as well, because again, we see over plowing of the soil, and then that contributes to less health. Livestock ranching is next. This is also commercial, and it is done in semi-arid or arid lands. So an example of that type of climate would be like tropical, steppe, or desert. So in these regions, vegetation is really sparse and the soil is very, very poor. It is not arable. So these regions are oftentimes very remote, so far away from cities, and that contributes to really cheap land. And that's important because since the feeding of this livestock is done by allowing them to kind of roam the fields, then those huge areas of land are needed. Much of the western portion of the United States is dedicated to livestock ranching, as well as places in southern Brazil, Argentina, Australia, and we see a lot of countries in Central Asia, such as Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Kazakhstan, that are livestock ranching countries as well. In the U.S. today, we also see kind of a decrease in the amount of land that's used for ranching and an increase in the amount of land that is used for feedlots instead. So you can see here that the U.S. Typically is ranching cattle, which is also popular in South America. But you can check out these other regions of the world where things like sheep, goat, and not mentioned here, but camels are also ranched. Okay, Mediterranean agriculture. This is done in a Mediterranean climate, and so it originates here in this Mediterranean basin, but we also see it in similar climatic areas like California, Australia, and South Africa. This land has a lot of rolling hills. You can check it out here. And it may even have mountains. And this type of agriculture is devoted to diverse specialty crops. Some examples of these are grapes, olives, specific types of nuts, fruits, and flowers. So this is typically only in developed countries. And remember, the practice of growing fruits, vegetables, and flowers is known as horticulture. So that might also be used in association with Mediterranean agriculture. All right, plantation farming. This is the only significant commercial agriculture that we find in less developed countries. So we see plantation farming in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. These farms are owned and operated by Europeans or North Americans, and they bring in migrant labor to work these plantations, and they are growing cash crops. So these cash crops are being grown in these least developed countries and then exported to those most developed countries as like luxuries. And so some examples of the types of crops grown here are like tobacco, bananas. This is a man who is tapping a rubber tree to make like tires. These right here are actually the shells of where cocoa beans come from, so where we get our chocolate from. And this right here, I believe is coffee beans. And so other examples are like sugar cane, tea, or palm oil. And this type of farming occurs in a climate that is tropical or humid subtropical. Many of these crops, while they're really suitable for these local environments, are not native to it. And remember, they are always getting exported. They are not being consumed locally. Lastly, I want to point out that these are very labor-intensive crops in which it's not really possible to use machinery to harvest them. So that's why they're located in these least developed countries because labor can be really cheap for those corporations that own the farms. Okay, the last thing that we're going to talk about is the agricultural regions of the United States. So looking at this map, I hope that you can kind of tell where these agricultural regions are. Remember that we are going to find dairy in region B of the United States, corn in region A, wheat in region F, orchards and fruits in region C, herding and ranching in region D, and tobacco in region E.